German prisoners stood in a muddy field in northern France with their hands on their heads. They were tired, beaten down, and worn out after 3 days of fighting British and Canadian troops. A British intelligence officer was questioning them, asking normal questions about their unit names and where they had been defending. Then, one prisoner said something that made the officer stop writing. The German soldier was a sergeant who spoke decent English. When asked which area he had been holding, he said his company had first been set up to fight the British, but when they heard that Canadians were moving into their sector, half of his men slipped away during the night instead of staying to face them. At first, the officer thought the man was exaggerating or confused, but as he questioned more prisoners, he heard the same thing again and again. German soldiers were more afraid of Canadians than of British troops, and they openly admitted it. This took place in August 1944, during the Allied breakout from Normandy. When the intelligence report reached British headquarters, it caused an awkward problem that no one really knew how to deal with. The British Army had been fighting Germany since 1939. Canadian forces had only arrived in large numbers in 1943, yet in just over a year of fighting, Canadian troops had somehow gained a reputation among German soldiers as being more aggressive, tougher, and more dangerous than the British. More reports kept coming in from prisoner interviews, captured German papers, and intercepted radio messages. They all said the same thing. German soldiers would rather fight the British than the Canadians. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, who commanded the 21st Army Group made up of British and Canadian forces, received a summary of these reports in early September while planning operations in Belgium. Montgomery was proud, confident, and very sure of himself, but he also took intelligence seriously, even when it challenged his beliefs. These reports troubled him because they suggested something important about how different armies fought, something that affected how he should use his forces. Montgomery called a meeting with his senior officers. Present were his top intelligence officer, several British division commanders, and Lieutenant General Guy Simonds, who commanded the 1st Canadian Army. Montgomery began by reading parts of the prisoner reports. Germans said Canadians fought differently, took fewer prisoners, showed less mercy, and pushed forward harder. Then Montgomery asked the question everyone was thinking, but no one wanted to say out loud. Why were German soldiers more afraid of Canadians than of British troops? The first answers were predictable. Some British officers said German propaganda was exaggerating Canadian brutality to cover their own failures. Others suggested Canadians were newer to long-term fighting and had not yet learned the unwritten rules about holding back on the battlefield. A few thought cultural differences between Britain and Canada might explain the behavior. Guy Simonds offered another explanation. He said Canadian soldiers fought harder and showed less restraint because they were volunteers who had crossed an ocean to fight a war that did not directly threaten their homes. They were not defending their own land. They were in Europe by choice. Soldiers who choose to fight often do so more aggressively than those defending their own country. British troops were fighting to protect their island and free Europe. Canadians were fighting because they decided to be there, and that created a different mindset. Montgomery listened carefully and then said something his staff found both smart and unsettling. He said the Germans feared Canadians because Canadians fought the way Germans themselves had fought early in the war. Fast, aggressive, willing to take losses to reach their goals, and not slowed down by the careful planning that often defined British operations. Montgomery added that this was not necessarily praise. That kind of fighting had helped Germany at first, but it had also caused massive losses when things went wrong. The real question was whether Canadian aggression would help them win the long war ahead or cost them too much. To understand what Montgomery meant, you have to look at how Canadian troops had fought since arriving in Europe. Their first major operation was the Dieppe raid in August 1942. It was a disaster. Nearly 3,000 Canadians were killed or captured in a badly planned attack on a heavily defended French port. The mission failed completely, but it taught Canadian leaders harsh lessons about German defenses and amphibious assaults. When Canadian forces returned to Europe for the invasion of Sicily in July 1943, they came with a new mindset. They had studied Dieppe and decided success required hitting hard, moving fast after any breakthrough, and accepting losses instead of stopping to regroup. This was very different from the careful step-by-step style often used by British forces, and it led to very different results. In Sicily, Canadian troops pushed through the center of the island while British units advanced along the coast. Canadians faced strong German defenses around towns like Leonfort and Aguirre. Instead of stopping to call for heavy artillery, they attacked straight on with infantry and tanks, taking heavy losses but keeping their momentum. The fighting was brutal and costly, but Canadian units kept moving forward while British forces nearby stalled against similar German positions. German reports from Sicily began noting these differences. Canadians used less artillery before attacking, which meant less warning. They kept advancing even while taking casualties, making it hard for Germans to organize counterattacks. They were also more aggressive in close fighting, especially in towns, where Canadians were willing to fight house to house instead of relying on artillery or airstrikes. This pattern continued in Italy through late 1943. Canadian troops fought at Ortona in December, a month-long urban battle that became infamous for its violence. German paratroopers defended the town one building at a time. Canadian infantry cleared it the same way. They blasted through walls instead of moving down streets. They threw grenades into rooms before entering. They pushed forward, even when units were reduced to just a few men. A German intelligence report later described Canadian tactics at Ortona as similar to the brutal fighting on the Eastern Front. The report noted that Canadians fought with a level of aggression and disregard for casualties that German forces associated with Soviet troops, not Western Allied armies. The report recommended that German units facing Canadians should expect close-quarters combat and should not assume the enemy would break off attacks even when taking severe losses. This reputation followed Canadian forces when they transferred from Italy to Northwest Europe in early 1944 to prepare for the Normandy invasion. German intelligence distributed briefings about Canadian units, warning that they were among the most dangerous Allied forces and should be engaged with maximum strength whenever possible. These warnings were based on actual combat experience from Sicily and Italy, not propaganda or speculation. When Canadian forces landed at Juno Beach on D-Day, June 6, 1944, they faced strong German resistance from the 716th Infantry Division and elements of the 21st Panzer Division. The landings were costly, but Canadian troops pushed farther inland on D-Day than any other Allied force, reaching objectives that weren't supposed to be taken until D+2 or D+3. They did this by maintaining aggressive forward movement even when taking casualties, exactly the approach they'd developed in Sicily and Italy. The fighting in Normandy through June and July reinforced German perceptions that Canadians were exceptionally dangerous opponents. Canadian forces were involved in some of the heaviest fighting around Caen, attacking fortified German positions repeatedly despite horrific casualties. Operations like Charnwood and Atlantic saw Canadian infantry and armor advancing against prepared German defenses anchored by SS Panzer divisions, the best troops Germany had available. German commanders noted that Canadian attacks were often poorly coordinated compared to British operations. Canadian artillery preparation was sometimes inadequate, tank infantry cooperation was imperfect, and command and control sometimes broke down in the chaos of combat. But what the Canadians lacked in tactical sophistication, they made up for in sheer aggression. They would attack when British forces were consolidating. They would push forward when other units were calling for reinforcements, and they would continue operations even when suffering casualty rates that would cause other formations to halt and reorganize. The 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, which faced Canadian forces repeatedly in Normandy, developed a particular respect for their opponents. These were teenage German fanatics, indoctrinated Nazis who'd been taught that SS troops were racially superior to their enemies. Yet their combat reports consistently described Canadian infantry as tough, aggressive, and dangerous. One Hitlerjugend officer wrote in his diary that fighting Canadians was like fighting fellow SS troops. They just kept coming regardless of casualties. This comparison to SS troops was actually significant because it pointed to something darker about how Canadians fought. The SS on both sides had reputations for not taking prisoners, for shooting surrendering enemies, for committing war crimes in the heat of combat. Canadian troops developed similar patterns, particularly in Normandy, where the fighting was especially bitter. Multiple incidents occurred where Canadian soldiers shot German prisoners or killed Germans attempting to surrender. The most documented cases involved the 12th SS, who had executed Canadian prisoners early in the Normandy campaign. Canadian troops responded with their own executions, creating a cycle of reprisal killings that both sides acknowledged but neither tried seriously to stop. British troops fighting alongside Canadians noticed this pattern and reported it up their chain of command, creating awkward questions about whether Allied forces were committing war crimes. The reality was complicated. Some killings of prisoners were revenge for German atrocities. Some were heat-of-battle situations where scared soldiers shot enemies who were trying to surrender. Some were deliberate decisions by officers or NCOs who didn't want to spare men to guard prisoners during active operations. And some were simply murder, soldiers killing defeated enemies because they could and because nobody was enforcing the rules of war very strictly in the chaos of Normandy. British forces had similar incidents, but they were less frequent and less systematic. British military culture emphasized restraint and proper treatment of prisoners, reinforced by officers who'd been trained in a professional military tradition that valued honorable conduct. Canadian forces, built rapidly from civilian volunteers and led by officers with less formal military education, had a more pragmatic attitude. Prisoners were a logistics problem, and in the middle of an offensive, solving that problem by shooting them was sometimes the path of least resistance. German soldiers noticed this difference. In prisoner interrogations, captured Germans would sometimes specifically request to be turned over to British rather than Canadian custody because they believed, probably correctly, that Canadians were more likely to shoot prisoners during the confusion of combat. These requests appeared in intelligence reports and created uncomfortable awareness among Allied commanders that their forces were developing different reputations for how they treated defeated enemies. Montgomery understood that this reputation was both an advantage and a problem. The advantage was that German troops genuinely feared Canadian attacks more than British ones, which meant German commanders had to commit their best troops against Canadians, even when it might be more advantageous to deploy them elsewhere. The problem was that the reputation was built partly on behavior that violated the laws of war and could create political complications if it became widely publicized. At the September staff meeting, after listening to explanations for why Germans feared Canadians, Montgomery reportedly addressed this issue directly. He said that Canadian aggressiveness was useful tactically, but it had to be controlled or it would undermine Allied moral authority. Germany was losing the war partly because Nazi atrocities had united the world against them. If Allied forces started committing similar atrocities, even on a smaller scale, it would weaken the moral foundation of the entire war effort. Guy Simons, the Canadian commander, pushed back on this characterization. He argued that what Montgomery called atrocities were simply the inevitable results of intense combat against an enemy that had shown no restraint. German forces had executed prisoners, bombed civilians, and committed countless war crimes throughout the war. Expecting Canadian soldiers to maintain perfect discipline while fighting such an enemy under brutal conditions was unrealistic. Simons said he would enforce discipline where possible, but he wouldn't apologize for Canadian troops fighting harder and more aggressively than their British counterparts. This exchange highlighted a fundamental difference in how British and Canadian forces approached the war. British military culture emphasized professionalism, discipline, and fighting within established rules, even against enemies who violated those rules. This approach had advantages in maintaining morale and unit cohesion, but it also sometimes led to excessive caution and missed opportunities. Canadian forces, less bound by traditional military culture, were more willing to bend or break rules if doing so provided tactical advantages. This made them more effective in certain situations, but also more prone to discipline problems and potential war crimes. Montgomery recognized that both approaches had value and that his challenge as Army Group Commander was to employ British and Canadian forces in roles that suited their different strengths. The pattern that emerged over the following months reflected this understanding. Canadian forces were often assigned to aggressive offensive operations where their willingness to take casualties and push forward regardless of losses was an advantage. British forces were more often used for set-piece battles where careful planning and methodical execution were essential. Operation Totalize in August of 1944 exemplified this division of labor. The operation was designed to break through German lines south of Caen, using armored divisions advancing at night. Guy Simons, who planned the operation, assigned Canadian divisions to lead the initial breakthrough, knowing they would maintain forward momentum even when encountering unexpected resistance. British armored divisions were held in reserve to exploit the breakthrough once Canadian forces had punched through the German lines. The operation worked exactly as Simons predicted. Canadian forces attacked at night, suffered heavy casualties, but broke through the first German defensive line. British armor moved through the breach and advanced into open country beyond. The combination of Canadian aggressiveness creating the breakthrough and British professionalism exploiting it proved highly effective. German commanders defending against Totalize reported being surprised by the ferocity of the Canadian night attack. They'd expected a more cautious British-style advance and had positioned their reserves accordingly. When Canadian armor came rolling through their lines in darkness, accepting losses to maintain momentum, the German defense collapsed faster than their commanders could reorganize it. This pattern repeated through the fall of 1944 as Allied forces advanced across France and Belgium. Canadian divisions were consistently assigned to difficult operations, requiring aggressive attacks against strong German positions. The Scheldt campaign in October and November saw Canadian forces fighting through flooded terrain against determined German resistance to clear the approaches to Antwerp. It was brutal, costly fighting that required exactly the kind of relentless aggression that Canadian troops had become known for. British divisions, meanwhile, handled operations requiring more careful coordination or where casualties had to be minimized for political reasons. Montgomery understood that British public opinion was less tolerant of heavy casualties than Canadian public opinion, partly because Britain had been at war since '39 and had already suffered enormous losses. Canada, being farther from the fighting and more recently engaged in heavy combat, had more political room to accept casualties in exchange for operational success. The different tolerance for casualties reflected different strategic situations. Britain was fighting for its survival as a major power and couldn't afford to bleed its army white even in victory. Canada was fighting to support Britain and maintain its position within the Commonwealth, but Canadian survival didn't depend on winning the war. This created different calculations about acceptable loss rates. German intelligence recognized these patterns and adjusted their deployments accordingly. When German commanders had to choose where to position their best troops, they often placed them against expected Canadian attacks rather than British ones. This meant Canadian forces consistently faced stronger opposition than British units, which in turn meant Canadian casualties were higher and their advances sometimes slower, despite their aggressive tactics. Montgomery was aware of this dynamic and accepted it as the price of using Canadian forces as his primary offensive punch. He told his staff that Canadian divisions were his shock troops, the formations he committed when he needed to break through strong defenses regardless of cost. British divisions were his exploitation force, the units he used to take advantage of breakthroughs that Canadian attacks created. This assessment wasn't entirely fair to British forces, who conducted their own share of difficult operations and suffered heavy casualties in fights like Operation Market Garden. But there was enough truth in it that both British and Canadian commanders recognized the pattern. Canadian troops were being used as battering rams, smashing through German defenses so that British forces could advance through the gaps. The question was whether Canadian troops and Canadian public opinion would accept this role. Through 1944, the answer was generally yes. Canadian forces took pride in their reputation as tough, aggressive troops. Soldiers knew that German defenders feared them, and this knowledge boosted morale even when casualties were heavy. Canadian newspapers reported on the fighting in heroic terms, emphasizing Canadian achievements and downplaying losses. But by early 1945, as the war dragged on and Canadian casualties mounted, questions began emerging about whether Canadian forces were being used appropriately. Canadian military commanders started pushing back against assignments to the most difficult operations, arguing that Canadian divisions had taken disproportionate casualties and needed time to rest and refit. Montgomery faced the delicate problem of how to maintain operational effectiveness while managing the politics of coalition warfare. The issue came to a head during the Rhineland campaign in February and March of 1945. Montgomery planned a massive offensive to clear German forces west of the Rhine River, and his initial plan assigned Canadian divisions to conduct the main attack through heavily defended territory, while British forces advanced through less strongly held sectors. Guy Simons objected, arguing that Canadian forces had already borne the brunt of heavy fighting through the Scheldt and the winter battles, and it was time for British divisions to take on the most difficult missions. Montgomery modified his plan, assigning British divisions to share the burden of the main attacks. But the underlying tension remained. Montgomery still believed Canadian troops were his best option for aggressive offensive operations, while Canadian commanders believed their forces were being used disproportionately in the most costly roles. The final months of the war saw both British and Canadian forces advancing into Germany against collapsing German resistance. The fighting remained intense in some sectors, but the overall German position was deteriorating so rapidly that operational planning became less about breaking through strong defenses and more about advancing as quickly as possible to reach Berlin before Soviet forces arrived. In this final phase, the different characteristics of British and Canadian forces became less relevant. Both armies were advancing against an enemy that was running out of men, equipment, and will to fight. The aggressiveness that had made Canadian troops so valuable in earlier battles was less necessary when German units were surrendering en masse or simply melting away before Allied advances. When the war in Europe ended in May of 1945, Montgomery's relationship with Canadian forces had evolved considerably from the awkward intelligence briefing in September of '44. He'd learned to use Canadian divisions effectively as assault troops while managing the political sensitivities around casualty rates and operational assignments. He'd also developed genuine respect for Canadian combat effectiveness, even if he remained uncomfortable with some of the methods Canadian troops employed. Montgomery's post-war memoirs addressed the question of German fears of Canadian troops in characteristically blunt terms. He wrote that Canadian soldiers fought with a ferocity that German troops recognized and respected because it mirrored their own approach to combat. He noted that this aggressiveness came at a cost in casualties and sometimes in discipline, but it had proven tactically valuable throughout the Northwest Europe campaign. He also wrote something more subtle that captured the complexity of coalition warfare. Montgomery observed that British and Canadian forces, while fighting for the same cause and under unified command, approached combat with meaningfully different philosophies shaped by their different histories and strategic situations. Managing these differences required understanding that there was no single correct way to fight, only approaches that were more or less suitable for specific tactical situations. The statistics bore out the reality of how Canadian forces were employed. Canadian divisions in Northwest Europe suffered higher casualty rates per capita than British divisions, reflecting their consistent assignment to difficult offensive operations. From D-Day to VE Day, Canadian forces comprising roughly 10% of 21st Army Group's strength accounted for nearly 15% of the casualties. This disparity reflected both the dangerous missions Canadian forces were assigned and their aggressive prosecution of those missions. German casualty statistics showed similar patterns. German units that fought against Canadian forces suffered higher losses than those fighting British forces, suggesting that Canadian aggressiveness imposed costs on both sides. The ratio of German to Canadian casualties was actually less favorable than the ratio of German to British casualties, meaning that while Canadian attacks were often successful, they achieved success through mutual attrition rather than through inflicting disproportionate losses on the enemy. These statistics raised questions about whether Canadian aggressive tactics were actually more effective than British methodical approaches, or whether they simply represented a different trade-off between casualties and operational tempo. Montgomery's answer, based on his employment of both types of forces, was that both approaches had value depending on the situation. When breakthrough attacks were necessary regardless of cost, Canadian aggressiveness was valuable. When minimizing casualties while maintaining pressure was the priority, British methods were preferable. The legacy of German fears of Canadian troops extended beyond the war itself. Post-war interviews with German veterans consistently mentioned Canadian forces as particularly tough opponents. German memoirs from the period often devoted more attention to fighting Canadians than to other Allied forces, reflecting the impression Canadian aggressiveness had made on German soldiers who survived the encounters. This reputation became part of Canadian military identity in the post-war period. Canadian forces took pride in being seen as elite troops who'd earned German respect through combat effectiveness. The story of German soldiers deserting rather than face Canadian attacks became part of Canadian military folklore, repeated in regimental histories and veterans' accounts. What was often left out of these celebratory accounts was Montgomery's original concern about the darker implications of Canadian combat methods. The prisoner killings, the excessive aggressiveness, the violations of laws of war that had contributed to German fears were quietly forgotten or justified as necessary responses to German atrocities. Canadian military history emphasized the positive aspects of the reputation while downplaying the problematic behaviors that had helped create it. Montgomery himself never publicly criticized Canadian combat methods after the war. He remained diplomatically supportive of Canadian forces in his memoirs and public statements, emphasizing their contributions to Allied victory while avoiding detailed discussion of how they achieved their results. But his private papers and staff meeting notes reveal ongoing concern about balancing the tactical value of Canadian aggressiveness against the moral and political costs. The question Montgomery raised in that September '44 staff meeting remained relevant throughout the remainder of the war. Were Canadian forces fighting like early war Germans, and if so, Was that sustainable? The answer turned out to be that Canadian aggressiveness was sustainable as long as the war itself remained relatively short. From mid-43 to mid-45, Canadian forces could maintain their aggressive operational tempo because they knew the war was winnable and would likely end within a defined time frame. Had the war continued into 46 or 47, Canadian forces almost certainly would have had to moderate their approach. The casualty rates they'd sustained through 44 and 45 weren't sustainable indefinitely, and Canadian public opinion would eventually have demanded a shift to less costly methods. But because the war ended when it did, Canadian forces never faced that reckoning. Instead, they entered the post-war period with a reputation as elite assault troops who'd earned German respect through combat effectiveness. That reputation shaped Canadian military identity for decades, influencing how Canadian forces saw themselves and how they approached subsequent conflicts. The lesson Canadian military culture took from World War II was that aggressiveness and willingness to accept casualties were virtues that produced victory. Whether this lesson was entirely accurate remains debatable. Canadian forces certainly achieved significant tactical successes through aggressive operations, but they also suffered casualties that a larger nation with different strategic imperatives might have considered unacceptable. The effectiveness of Canadian methods depended partly on the specific context of 1944 and 45, when Allied material superiority was overwhelming and German defeat was inevitable. Montgomery understood these nuances better than most because he'd commanded both British and Canadian forces and had seen how they performed in different situations. His assessment was that Canadian troops were extraordinarily valuable for specific types of operations, but that their methods weren't universally applicable. The German fear of Canadian forces reflected genuine Canadian combat effectiveness, but it also reflected tactics that came with costs Montgomery wasn't entirely comfortable accepting. When Montgomery said that Canadians fought like Germans, he wasn't offering simple praise. He was recognizing that Canadian forces had adopted an approach to combat that prioritized aggression and offensive momentum over careful husbanding of resources and minimizing casualties. This approach had worked for Germany when they were winning in 40 and 41. It worked for Canada in 44 and 45 when they were part of a coalition with overwhelming material advantages. But Montgomery knew from studying military history that this style of warfare was unsustainable in the long run. Armies that accepted high casualties eventually ran out of trained soldiers. Forces that prioritized aggression over discipline eventually suffered from declining combat effectiveness as veterans were killed and replaced with inexperienced troops. The question was whether Canadian forces would recognize these limitations or whether they'd internalize the lessons of 1944 and 45 as permanent truths about how to fight. The test would come in future conflicts, in Korea and later in Afghanistan, where Canadian forces would face very different strategic and tactical situations. But in the immediate aftermath of World War II, the prevailing narrative was simple. Canadian troops had fought harder, more aggressively and more effectively than their British counterparts, earning German respect and contributing disproportionately to Allied victory. Montgomery's more nuanced understanding, his recognition that Canadian methods came with costs as well as benefits, was largely lost in the celebratory post-war atmosphere. The field marshal who'd commanded the forces that defeated Germany was too diplomatic to publicly question the methods of his Canadian subordinates, and Canadian commanders had no incentive to highlight the problematic aspects of how their forces had fought. So the story that entered the historical record was the heroic version. German soldiers feared Canadian troops more than British forces. This fear reflected Canadian combat superiority. Montgomery recognized and valued Canadian effectiveness. All of this was true, as far as it went. What was left unsaid was Montgomery's concern about whether Canadian methods were sustainable, his discomfort with some of how Canadian troops had achieved their fearsome reputation, and his understanding that the specific circumstances of 44 and 45 had made Canadian aggressiveness tactically valuable in ways that might not apply in different conflicts. The full story was more complicated than either celebration or criticism could capture. Canadian forces had fought effectively using methods that were well suited to their specific situation. They had earned a genuine reputation among German soldiers as dangerous opponents. Montgomery had recognized this and had employed Canadian forces in roles that took advantage of their strengths. But the reputation had come at a cost in casualties and sometimes in adherence to the laws of war. And the tactical success didn't necessarily mean Canadian methods represented a universal model for how to fight. What Montgomery said when he realized German soldiers feared Canadian troops more than British forces was that Canadians fought like Germans. It was an observation that contained both respect and warning, acknowledging effectiveness while questioning sustainability. Like many of Montgomery's assessments, it was more insightful than it initially appeared, and more complicated than simple praise or criticism could capture. The German fear of Canadian troops was real, built on actual combat experience and genuine Canadian combat effectiveness. How that effectiveness was achieved, what it cost, and whether the methods were ultimately sustainable remained questions that Montgomery raised but didn't fully answer. The war ended before those questions became critical, leaving them for future conflicts and future generations of Canadian soldiers to resolve.